Hi, everyone, and welcome. We'll go ahead and get started here in just a few minutes. We're going to give some time for everyone to trickle in before we get into all the good stuff.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be, and welcome to our Azure Cost Management Advisory Hour. We are going to have some fun today. So what we'd like to do is, as we progress through this process, if you have a question, we have the Q&A enabled for everybody. So you can go to the question and answer and do that. You can raise your hand if you would like to be text it if you'd like to do a comment in the text. If you want to use chat, we're going to start out with a simple little poll. You should see that pop up on your screen. And what we're asking about is just to kind of level set where everybody's at coming into this. What cost savings mechanisms are you using today? RI, savings plans, MAC agreement, none of the above. So if you can go ahead and fill that out, and then we will start here momentarily. Welcome. Okay, so great job on the poll, everyone. Looks like everyone's had their coffee or tea or whatever their beverage of choice is this Friday morning. So I'm going to send it over to James now to start the presentation. James?
Thanks, Rodney. So as Rodney said, we want this to be more of a discussion than me just hammering through the slides. So feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, raise your hand, make this more of a conversational meeting. So brief intro to me, James Jeffries. I am an enterprise architect with Parax Technology. I've been in IT about 30 years now. I've been working with Azure for the last 14 to 15 years. Everything from migrations, management, optimization, and then some more specialty areas within those frameworks. Today's agenda. So we're going to be focused on Azure cost management. We're going to be specifically diving into the compute side of cost management. So Azure Hybrid Benefit, as an example, is a way that you can save money on the licensing with Azure. We're not going to cover that today. And these are the three specific areas within compute that we're going to focus on. And as you can see from this, I've outlined some high-level percentage opportunities for savings within each one of these. It's important to note, I'm going to cover this later as we talk about the MAC agreement. None of these three can overlap each other. And what I mean by that is if you have an instance in Azure that's covered by a reserved instance, you're not going to achieve the savings plan discount when you add your commitment to the savings plan. Same thing with the MAC agreement. If you've got instances that are protected by RIs or they're covered by a savings plan discount, you will not get the savings from the MAC agreement. So the first thing we're going to talk about is Azure Reserved Instances. This has the highest percentage of potential savings. We're going to go through key points of reservations. We're going to talk about scoping and flexibility groups. And then we're going to talk about how we monitor our existing reservations, make sure they're being utilized. And later on in the presentation, we're going to cover right sizing. Where it's appropriate for each one of these, I'm also going to give a demo of our proof of concept portal in Azure to show you these different metrics that we can look at. So Azure reservations, key points. So you can buy an Azure reservation for either 1 year or 3 year. Best practices is what we like to call the 80-20 rule. And what that is we would like to see 80% of your workloads covered under an Azure reservation and 20% covered by savings plan. Another important point with Azure reservations is there is a cancellation threshold. Unlike savings plan or a MAC agreement, Microsoft allows you to cancel up to 50 grand on a 12-month rolling calendar. That is especially important if you're just getting into Azure or you have a smaller Azure tenant that has less than an annual 50K spend or $4,167 a month. You may as well get 3-year RIs on everything you can. Because even if something changes direction within the organization and the business decides they don't need Azure anymore, you can cancel all those resources without any penalty. So you may as well take the discount if your threshold is below the 50 grand. If not, then that's a discussion with the business, and we have to start understanding what resources are going to be there and for how long. Another thing with reservations that you can do that you can't do for savings plan is that reserved instances can be traded in for savings plan. Where this becomes important is, let's say you switch from VMs to more dynamic workloads like VM scale sets or Kubernetes, Databricks, or you just start scaling your resources, meaning you've got this virtual machine that you have an RI attached to. Currently, it's up for 24 hours a day, so buying an RI for that SKU makes sense. And in the future, you decide that, hey, this server can be shut down from 7 p.m. till 8 in the morning, and we can save half the cost on it. At that point, you'd be paying more for the reservation than you'd be paying for the actual retail compute. So in that case, you could trade in your reserved instances for savings plan. Exchanges. So it feels like this is getting changed almost every month by Microsoft. But as of today, you can only exchange reserved instances for other VM SKUs, dedicated host, or specific app service plans. And then the other thing we wanted to mention, payment can be upfront. So you can pay, if you're doing 1 year RI, you can pay that whole year upfront, or you can pay it monthly. Same applies for a 3 year. There is no savings discount or additional savings discount for paying upfront versus monthly.
James, we got a question on SKUs.
Yeah.
Do the SKUs have to match 1 for 1, or can we have a bigger SKU to cover smaller SKUs? Or how is that process calculated with reserved instances?
That's a great question, and that's going to lead into our flexibility groups later. But to answer that question, so a bigger SKU can apply to 2 smaller SKUs. So if you have a B8 MS SKU, it would apply at 100% to 2 B4 MSs. One of the things we're going to cover further along in this presentation is what's called flexibility groups, which is a new preview feature when you're buying reserved instances. What it allows you to do is buy a family. So you could buy a B4 or family, and it would cover B4 MS, B4 AS, etc. And that allows you more flexibility at the same discount. Okay, scoping. I'm going to switch here and show you the demo on this, but I'm just going to go over high level. So scoping, so one of the common misconceptions is that when you buy reserved instance, you're buying it for a specific server or a specific PaaS resource. That's not the case. So reserved instances are purchased by a SKU or a SKU family. Now you can scope those reserved instances to a specific resource group. You can scope it to a subscription, or you can do a shared scope, which would apply across multiple subscriptions based on what the billing context is. And that differentiates between CSP, EA, MCA, etc. A new preview feature is you can do a scoping to a management group. So anyone who dove into Azure governance at some point, one of the first recommendations is to have a hierarchy of management groups where you group your subscriptions under a hierarchy. So this scoping would allow you to, say, scope it to the root management group, and it would apply to any potential subscriptions underneath that root management group. I'm going to show you guys a demo real quick. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay, so when you're buying a reservation, the two things that we're talking about in the slide we just went over in the next slide is scope. So this is where you would set the scoping option when you're buying a reserved instance. In the next slide, we're going to go over instance flexibility or flexibility groups. You see it's a preview feature, but what it allows you to do, and if we watch the recommendations here, so it's specifically calling out a certain SKU family. As this refreshes, what it's going to do, you see what it did was it lowered the SKU and focused more on a family, and it increased the quantity. And that gives you more flexibility. So instead of buying one B4, right, we're going to buy 8 of them here to cover the resources. Okay. All right, so let's dive into flexibility groups, which we just saw in the demo. And I've just outlined here for you an example of why the instance flexibility groups make sense. We recommend it at US Cloud. Our cost optimization product that we use actually will calculate those recommendations for you as well. And this is just an example. So if you bought a reservation with a flexibility group on the BAS V2 series, it would apply to any 6 of these SKU sizes. Process to add. So we just went over this. So within your Azure portal, you have a reservation blade. From there, you can go to add. It actually looks at Advisor initially and provides recommendations to you. Setting the instance flexibility will set those to a more general family SKU, and it'll increase the quantity while decreasing the SKU. Monitoring usage. So I wanted to show this in our proof of concept portal, but because it's a proof of concept portal, resources aren't kept there for very long. We don't have any reservations. So I provided you some screenshots of what this looks like. Same concept when you go into reservations in the Azure portal, it's going to give you a high level of all the RIs you purchased. And to the right, you're going to have 2 columns, usage over the last day, and then usage over a 7-day period. You can click into each one of these, and what it'll allow you to do is extend or provide a custom time range to make sure that reservation's at 100%. And then what you don't see here is it actually will show you down below during that time range what specific server it was utilizing for that reservation. And what we want to see here is, we go back one. If we're not getting 100% coverage here, we're overpaying, right? So then that's when we have to look at cancellation or exchanging it for a different size, etc. All right, now we're going to dive into savings plans. Again, we're going to go over the key points. I'm going to show you an example of how to calculate that commitment. And I'm also going to show you how to monitor the usage on the savings plans. So again, with savings plan, we use our 80-20 rule. We want 20% of your resources to be covered by savings plan. The most common and best use case for savings plan is dynamic workloads. I gave examples earlier of VM scale sets, Databricks, Kubernetes. anything where resources are getting spun up and spun down based on usage, buying an RI for that is a challenge because you may not have those resources online 24 hours a day. In that case, savings plan, which is an hourly commit purchase you're making, allows you to cover those workloads that are not covered by RIs. Important point with savings plan, it's a 1 or a 3 year term and you cannot cancel it. So we don't want to overcommit to savings plan. You can always add additional savings plans later on to cover new resources. We don't want to overcommit. And just like RI's payment can be upfront or monthly, there is no discount on either one of those options. So calculating savings plan. Generally, the order of operations is we want to get our right sizing and RIs in place first. The reason we want to do that is we can't see what our actual 20% commit outside of that's going to be without doing a lot of math and trying to make some guesses on things that may change. So we generally, again, want RIs in place first. Once that's done, and I'm going to show you a demo of this in the portal after this slide, what we're going to do is when you look at the cost analysis inside of the Azure portal, the default accumulated cost view is showing you cost outside of your reservations. There's a separate view for reservations. So essentially, in this case, actual cost, $1.6 million. What we would do to determine what our hourly commit should be is divide that by the number of days in that month and divide it by 24, and that'll get us an hourly commit number. Now, we don't want to take 1 month as a sample size, right? Because that you may have had more usage during that month. You may have had resources spun up that are going to be turned down. So generally, the recommendation is you get 2 or 3 months of a sample size, calculate what your hourly commit's going to be, and then this will be purchased again after your RIs and after you've right-sized resources. I'm going to switch here and just show you how that view looks so you're aware of it. Again, when you go into search resources, cost analysis, you have your different views. The view that we're looking at there is accumulated cost. You can also look at the resource view, which gives you a cost per resource that's exportable. I'll show that. This is all exportable to Excel. And this breaks down each resource and what the associated cost is. Example in this one, here's our cost for the VM. There's a less than a penny cost on bandwidth. You may also see the license in there as well.
So we had a question come in on this. Is there a way to build automation around saving plans and RIs, like the exchange of RIs to get to the 100% commitment?
That's a good question. I'm going to have to take that offline and get back to you on that. There is so the purchase of Reservations or savings plan can be automated. I don't believe right now there's a way to bake in appropriately what that commit should be. But I'll directly respond to whoever submitted that question offline and get the answer.
Thank you.
So again, in this case, we're looking at April. Here's what the actual cost would be to calculate what our savings is going to be, what our savings plan is going to look like. We would take this, divide it by the number of days we've had in April, divide that by 24, and that's going to be our hourly commit. Monitoring, again, proof of concept tenant. I don't have existing savings plans there. It's the same concept as reservations. You go to the savings plan blade inside of the Azure portal. It's going to show you a high level utilization, right? So we can see in this case here, 96%. So we overcommitted here on the savings plan. Right? We want this to be 100. We can dig it by clicking through those savings plans. You can customize time frame, look at percentage, etc. All right, Mac. So this is an agreement that gets negotiated directly with Microsoft. It's a Microsoft Azure consumption commitment. I'm going to show in the following slides an example use case. We're really going to go over why we don't think that the Mac agreement is a good thing. And it's based on best practices from Microsoft and some of the US cloud experience that we have with existing customers that have been under a Mac agreement. Okay, so key points. Again, we talked about this up front. Mac agreement cannot overlap with our Azure savings plan. Any amount of commitment not satisfied at the end of the term is a balloon payment that's due to Microsoft. Now, based on the type of agreement you're in, if you're a managed client, unmanaged, sometimes Microsoft can take and, allocate that towards other credits. But either way, we're going to use this use case here that's going to show, again, why we don't think the Mac agreement's a good thing. So in this scenario, let's assume customer's annual spend's $1 million for even numbers. Microsoft approaches them, presents a Mac agreement for $3 million over a 3-year term, and they're going to give them 7.5% discount on their spend outside of our Azure savings plan. So bullet point 2 is really the most important thing to understand with this. So that 7.5% discount only applies to resources not covered by our Azure savings plan. So if the customer has their tenant configured per Microsoft's best practices using the 80-20 rule, they're going to save nothing because there's nothing left to save on the 7.5. Now let's go over a couple scenarios, one being the worst case, and I have actually witnessed this with customers. I worked with someone a few years ago that had to make a $6 million balloon payment to Microsoft. So worst case, at the end of the first year of the Mac agreement, one of the customer's applications moved to SaaS. Let's assume they had some kind of EMR or business line application that got moved to a SaaS platform, and now there's a couple dozen servers they no longer need in Azure. So instead of their annual spend being $1 million, it's now $800,000. So if this scenario took place at the end of that 3-year term, the customer would have to make a balloon payment of $400,000 to cover their commit. Now, the best case, even if the customer had spent the agreed upon $3 million or more, even if they added more resources and grew, they still would have saved nothing based on following the best practices of reservations and savings plan. All right, now we're going to dive into right sizing. So ideally, right sizing should be done up front. One of the challenges organizations run into, especially larger organizations, is when you've got distributed app owners, getting approval to right size their resources or downsize into something more appropriate, that can take a long time. That goes through a change management process, has to get approval, etc. One of the strategies that we recommend when we're going through different cost optimization exercises is to, if you've got a common family of resources, let's say you're using several F-series virtual desktop machines. So instead of committing to 100% of them because you're trying to right size, one of the things you can do in the interim is buy half of those RIs to see that cost savings. And then as you right size over the next year, you can then change those out into other SKUs or buy new longer term reservations.
We had a couple of questions coming in.
Yeah.
Someone asked why you can't get a discount on the RIs. Does the cost of the RI count towards your committed spend?
No, does not. We're talking about on the Mac agreement here, So
Yep.
I assume what that scenario is let's say you buy a, I don't know, let's say like a B16 SKU, and that reservation cost is $200. That is not eligible for that 7.5 discount. That is only for resources or any kind of resource spend in Azure not covered by RIs or savings plans.
So again, the moral of the story is if you do the 80% reserved instances, 20% cost savings plan, all your spend is covered there. There's nothing left here. The MAC agreement does you no good and can hurt you in the end.
Yep.
If you don't. Yep. All right. There's going to be more questions around the MAC at the end. Someone wants to. So keep in mind that we might still cover some more MAC stuff.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to show you guys a demo of Azure Advisor from the high level. We're going to go over some of the disadvantages of Advisor when we're looking at right sizing. And I'm also going to show you individual resources and how to actually look at the details there to get further examples of how that should be sized. And then we're going to also dive into why it's important to tag these resources and put tagging policies and governance around that. That's going to play into our cost analysis reporting. I'll be able to show you some demos of reporting based on tag. All right, so let me show you the demo first, then we'll go through these. So the first thing is Microsoft provides a tool called Advisor, and it's based on the 5 pillars of a well-architected framework. Specifically with this presentation, we're going to look at cost. It provides recommendations. You can see this is a proof of concept tenant. There's not a lot in here. Most tenants, you're going to see recommendations for reservations. You're probably going to see a savings plan. This is RIs. It's also going to provide one. I don't have an example of right sizing, but it's going to provide you recommendations on how to size your VMs. It's going to either say downsize these to these SKUs or upsize them to these SKUs. The problem with Advisor from a high level is it only considers CPU, memory, and network traffic. It looks at 3 counters. It also, by default, only goes back 30 days. That can be changed under this configuration option. You can change that look back period if you would like to. But again, those 3 metrics aren't necessarily enough. It doesn't look at any kind of disk utilization. It doesn't look at queue length. There's several other parameters that would go into your decision to right size a resource. So if we wanted to dig further into resource utilization, the metrics blade under monitoring for your virtual machine or under your different resources, so your SQL databases, your app service plans, any kind of past resource has its own specific set of metrics. Specifically on a VM, right, we can look at it, we can change the time frame, so we can go back last week. This is the available memory it's had. You can also change, you don't just want to look at average all the time. You want to look at case of memory, what's the minimum that it had. There's a percentage CPU when we're looking at VMs. So same concept, 7 days. So we can see once this was just created, so it's never used more than 11%. But we also probably want to look at the max as well to see the spikes. We can see at times that it jumped up to 38% here. And we've also got all these other counters we can look at that aren't considered by Advisor. Some of those common queue depth, right? So we're right here. So what queue depth that is on a disk is essentially how many commands are waiting at the disk level to be processed. We can look at IOPS consume percentage. So that's how we look at the different counters on the resource. You can see there's a handful of them based on the resource type. These are going to change. Specifically with the B series, one thing that's important is these 2 counters here. So if you're not familiar, the B series works on a CPU credit. Let me see, is this a B series? Actually, it is, so perfect example. Yeah, so you can see, so if you use with a B series, if you go through heavy periods of usage, your credits on the CPU are going to drop. So if you see this at 0, you know that's a problem. I need to upsize it. And it also tells you on the consumption level.
So we got a question coming in. For example, one of the server recommendations says that resize does, again, same VM might give one more time recommendation as technically observed that keep monitor and provide the recommendation advisor. Ideally, right size is not stable forever, but we can save money if we modify the SKU size. Correct?
Can you read that again, Rodney? I'm sorry. Okay, hang
Yeah,
on.
I
I
think
see in the chat. I see in the chat. Okay.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, it's in the chat.
Yes, you would save money by modifying the SKU. On the first part of the question, yeah, we want to constantly monitor advisor for those recommendations, but we want to take it as a high-level guideline and dig into the individual resources and look at the other metrics to determine if that makes sense. Common example I've seen is like a SQL Pass database might have a recommendation to downsize it, but then when you go look at the disk usage on there, it spikes to 100% several times throughout the day. All right, so in that case, if you downsize that SKU and it reduces the available IOPS available, that's going to cause some problems. Okay, tagging inside this borders on the governance side. This isn't a governance presentation, but I wanted to touch on this because it plays into the cost management reporting. So these are some key reasons why you would do tagging across your organization. And we're also going to cover policies that enforce that tagging. So when we're talking about tagging, one of the first things we have to do is define what that standard is going to be. And that's different based on organizational needs. A couple examples of common tags that we see are created by and created date. One of the misconceptions with Azure is that you can always go back and look at see who created a resource and when they did it. That activity is logged within the activity log, which by default is clear in 60 days. So if you're past that 60-day and you see a server there, you don't know what it's for or what the intended use case was. If we don't have that created by and created date tag, we're not going to know who created it and why. Other examples of tags that we see that are common is application. And I want you to think of tags as a way to report. So if the business comes to you and says, tell me how much Great Plains is costing me inside of Azure, if we have that application tag in place and enforced, you can run a report and cost analysis and separate it by that tag. So you can see here's all the resources associated with Great Plains, and here's my monthly cost associated to that. Other common tags are owner, right? So you might have an app owner, might be different than the person that created it. That might be the business resource that's responsible for that application. Cost center is common. If you do chargebacks where the cost of Azure is split amongst the responsible parties, cost center is a common tag we see. Environment, if you're not separating your management groups and your subscriptions based on dev test, UAT, production, etc., that environment would be a tag that would be important for you to understand what's our dev cost versus our production cost. So I'm going to show you Azure policy and a couple of those example policies. I'm going to show you also how to export your resources and include those tags as columns in there so you can see where the gaps are. And then we're not going to cover it directly, but we're just pointing out here the importance of if you're leveraging Azure DevOps or infrastructure as code, it's important to start having those teams or those groups add in the appropriate tags as standard. So new resources, modified resources going forward, get those tags. All right. So first, I just want to show you, here's how you would see all the tags that are currently in your environment. There's a tags blade here. It's going to show you all the different tags. And if you drill down into one of these tags, it's going to tell you the associated resources to that tag. How that plays in with cost analysis is, again, on this, right now we're looking at, we're looking at the accumulated cost view. You can actually come down here and you can filter by any of the tags you have defined in your environment. So we can see in this case, Great Plains is 0 cost, Tableau's $9.75. We've got some untagged resources. You can also filter on the other views based on tag, but I just wanted to show this example from a high level. Let's look at, let's dive into policy just so I can show you a couple of example policies. So again, policies, this was the original way to do it. Microsoft came out with blueprints, and before blueprints ever got out of preview, there's an end of life for them already. Those are being replaced with deployment stacks, which are missing some of the feature sets. So we see most of our clients leveraging policy directly. So here's a couple examples of policies that you can deploy. So you can, and it gives you your compliance percentage. You could set a policy to either be in enforced mode or audit mode. So in this case, we're just auditing. So we're saying we're looking for this particular tag. Let's say it's department on all the resources, and we're going to run this in audit mode. And if you need any help with these policies, it's something that creating a ticket with US Cloud, we can help you with those. Here's another example. So you can actually add a tag to resources. So you could have all of your resources under a specific resource group, for an example, automatically get the cost center tag or the department tag that's appropriate. And just to show you from a high level, if you ever need to modify the tags at a resource level, under any resource that supports tagging within Azure, you'll see these tags here. And it is freehand to monitor and make changes to any of these. You could create a new tag here, set its value, and keep in mind, because it's freehand, it's case sensitive. So department not capitalized is a completely different tag set than department capitalized.
So one point on that is we had customers have that issue with the upper and lower case. There is a way to do another policy to reapply your tags to move them to one case or the other. So you can move everything to all upper or all lower. We've had multiple customers do that, and then that kind of gets rid of that issue. So that and the policy would be put in place on new tags. So someone couldn't use uppers or lowers if you had specified one or the other as the only determination for tags. So there's a lot of things you can do with the tags and policies.
Yep, that's a good point. You can also, there's some automation around when you're creating a resource, instead of just letting that fail at the validation stage. So say you're requiring the department tag and someone tries to create a resource without it. Normally it gets to validation and fails. They've got to read through the error. You could actually have it prompt them before they get to that point to add that tag if it's missing. All right, key takeaways we're going to go over. We're going to talk about the US Cloud assessments that we have on cost optimization. We're going to outline some next steps to be able to help you out there. So we leverage a third-party tool set for a cost optimization, and there's a number of reasons why we do that. I'm going to go over. The tool set is by Viacode, and it's called VBox. The reason that we use this tool is it has several advantages over the built-in advisor tool. One, it actually considers, when you look at advisor and it's recommending savings plans and reserved instances, it doesn't take into account overlap. So that savings plan commit that advisor is recommending isn't accurate until your RIs are in place. VBox actually calculates that side by side with the presumption that you put those resources under a RI first. More detailed right sizing. As I pointed out, advisor only looks at network, memory, and CPU. The VBox considers disk and other utilization in its right sizing recommendations. It provides automation scripts. So a perfect example for this is one of the common things we see when we're doing cost optimization is orphaned resources, specifically disk and snapshots. So someone created a VM, they deleted that VM later on, but didn't delete the disk. So now you end up with, we just worked with a customer at 1,400 orphan disk in their organization. So going through 14, there's no multi-select when you're purging those disks in the UI. Someone, if they were going to use the UI to clean up those resources, they would have to go through 1,400 disks one at a time, purge it, and go to the next one. We have automation scripts that will go through all those and take care of that for you. VBox also has some advanced, what I'll call advanced recommendations that Advisor doesn't have. Two of them are storage account tiering. So it'll look at a storage account and see that no data has been accessed in 6 months, and it'll give the recommendation, change this tier from hot to cold or from cold to archive. The second is recovery services vaults redundancy. So historically, when you created a recovery service vault, it automatically set the replication to GRS. Most recovery services vaults don't need that kind of protection. They can just use LRS, which gives you 3 local copies of that backup data. GRS is over twice the cost of LRS. And then to make it worse, once you start backing up workloads in that recovery services vault, you can't change that replication type. So VBox will look at the resources being backed up into the vault and say, hey, you've got a GRS vault here that you're paying 5.5 cents a gig on. You could go to LRS and pay 2.5 cents.
We got a question that came in on more specifics on the scope of tags. Are tag policies specific to each subscription, or can they be applied across all subscriptions?
That is a great question. So they can be applied at the management group level, or at the subscription level, or at the resource group level. So you can apply most of those tagging policies and most of those remediation policies at a management group, and that would apply to multiple subscriptions underneath there. Or if you wanted to fine tune it even more, say you had a specific department that needed specific tags for reporting purposes, you could apply it to a resource group. Okay, next steps for cost optimization. If you want the help from US Cloud, we have 2 options for that. We have a free cost assessment using the VBox tool. It gives recommendations from a high level, but it doesn't give specific actionable recommendations. An example of that is it might say you could save 60 grand a year by changing your app service plans. It won't tell you which app service plans to change and what tier to change them to. And of course, we also have our full cost optimization with the VBox tool. We go through an 8-week session, scan the environment, provide baseline cost, detailed recommendations, and we have task assignment and some other advanced features within that tool set. And really, for either one of these options, submitting a ticket to US Cloud would start that engagement.
All right, we got some more questions coming in.
Okay.
I'm interested to learn how to best track tagging compliance. Also, inventory tags per resource. Would you use policy? I've tried using a workbook with resource graph queries. Then they also added a comment, thank you for the case sensitivity. So they want to know how to tag resources for inventory purposes.
When we say, so I think I need more context around that. When we say inventory purposes, are we looking at like to tag based on the OS or tag based on some features of the guest OS?
I think what they're asking for is, when they ask about tag compliance, is if I have 50 resource groups, what's my tagging compliant? What level of tags do I have? And what am I missing? Is there a way to get a report to figure out what's not tagged?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me show that real quick. So when we go back into our policy module here, so let's look at this particular one. So when you drill into the particular policy, it's actually going to show you the non-compliant and compliant resources with that tag. So all these non-compliant resources are missing that tag. And let me also show you, what I forgot to show before is if we look at, let me show this here. So if we look at, we can look at it at the resource group level, subscription level, but if we want to look at all resources in our tenant, there's this all resources module. You can actually add a column here for the tag. So if you were going to put a policy in place, for example, to say, I want all our resources to have an application tag, you can add this column. And what it allows you to do, see, this is only a handful of them that have this tag. You can export this to Excel, and then you can go through all these resources and tag them. And you can also use multi-select on any of these views. So I could say, for instance, I don't think I have access to these, but if I wanted to add a tag to them, you can select multi-select resources, do assign tags, and then add the appropriate tags from this view. I hope that answers the question.
While you're there in the demo, someone wanted to know if you could show the management groups, because they asked, can you briefly cover the point about how to bring all subscriptions under a cost management subscription?
So management groups, again, it's a way to separate your hierarchy. We don't have, let me see if I have rights to create one here. So in this case, everyone's got a tenant root group by default. How most people separate their management groups is by environment. There's also use cases where they do it by business line or department. So in the example of environment, I would create a management group for prod. I'd create one for dev test, and maybe I have one for UAT. So this takes a few minutes to refresh, but what it'll do is it'll show up the different management groups under this hierarchy, and then you move your subscriptions under those particular management groups. That way, when you're applying policies for prod, you apply it to that management group. And the reason you do that is policies generally differentiate by environment. There's things in dev test that you're going to allow that you're not in prod.
The next question is about VBox access. Does VBox require access to the customer environment? And if so, what access is needed?
Yeah, so VBox leverages Lighthouse to get read-only access to the tenant. They do that through the addition of a service provider inside of your Azure tenant. And you assign those delegated read-only permissions to each subscription that you want to analyze. One other point on here is after you get your hierarchy in place with management groups and you add the subscriptions there, when you're looking at cost analysis, one thing I want to point out is your views do change based on what you've selected. And what I mean by that is Right now we're at subscription level. Here's all the built-in views that you have. When you look at those views from a management group, they're slightly different. One example is the resource view isn't available at the management group level, but it is at the subscription level.
Okay, I don't see any other questions at this moment. If you have any questions, now's the time to ask. If you want to clarify, someone did want you to go back and cover that slide on the Mac again, just doing the math of the 1 million, 3 million. If you could just cover that again briefly. If we had time at the end, they wanted you to revisit that. Basically, It's a great option if you have Microsoft stock because it helps their stock.
And that's a former Microsoft employee as well, and Roddy.
Yeah, only for 7 years.
So example use case here, and I did this for even numbers. Let's assume your annual spend is $1 million. So when Microsoft engages you, and when I mentioned managed or unmanaged earlier, that can become important. So if someone from Microsoft contacts you and they've got a V- in their email, they are not a Microsoft employee. That is a vendor that's certified to resell different Microsoft products and options. Microsoft has a little bit less flexibility on discount and options when you're dealing with a V- versus with a managed client that'll be a true Microsoft employee you're negotiating that Mac agreement with. So again, use case, $1 million a year spend. Microsoft comes to you, says, okay, we're going to give you 7.5% discount. Typically, Mac agreements range from 5%. I think they start at 5%. The highest I've ever seen is 15%. This spend would be within the 7.5% range. So you've committed now to spend $3 million over 3 years, and in return, Microsoft's going to give you a 7.5% discount on any compute charges that are not covered by RIs or savings plan. And that's really the key here. And bullet point 2 outlines that here. So we're using the 80/20 rule. We've configured our tenant appropriately. Basically, that gives you 7.5% discount on nothing. So worst case that I pointed out here, it's tough to predict what the business or different application vendors are going to do. We've seen several instances where different app vendors are switching to SaaS-based products. They can make more money doing that. They get to control the resources, etc. So you're hosting all these servers, these other application extensions within your environment. They move to SaaS, those resources go away. So your tenant spend, instead of being $1 million, drops down to $800,000 in years 2 and 3. At the end of that term, a $400,000 balloon payment's due to Microsoft. In my experience, if you're a managed client, so you're talking with someone that's a Microsoft employee, what they can do with that balloon payment is they turn it into credits. So they'll give you $400,000 in, say, M365 licensing credits that you have to spend in the next 2 years. Right? So if you're dealing on a managed client with a Microsoft employee, you're not out that money necessarily, but you let Microsoft hold that $400,000 for 2 years for you and earn interest on it. And even the best case scenario here is, yeah, you do spend. Let's say you spend more than $3 million. Let's say you spend $4 million over 3 years. You've still saved nothing. The analogy I always like to use with this is, if the local grocery store that you went to came out with a commit plan and said, you're going to spend, if you spend $200 a week in groceries here, we're going to give you a 0% discount, but we're going to bill you for whatever you don't spend in 3 years. You would never do that deal, right? And that's exactly what Microsoft's proposing with this Mac agreement. The only time it makes sense is when you don't have your tenant configured appropriately.
That's a very good point. So someone said, hey, can we get another poll and talk more about cost optimization? So we're going to put up another poll. These are great questions in the Q&A, by the way. And in this poll, what we're looking for is how often do you review your costs in Azure? Do you do it daily, weekly, when it's time to shore up your budget, or frankly, you just never do it? Go ahead and submit your answers to that. While that one is being worked, we have another question that came in. Are managed tenants usually already under a MAC agreement by the managed vendor? Thus, myself as a customer would not be able to leverage savings plans, etc.
Not necessarily. So if you're a managed, I'm not 100% clear on the selection process Microsoft goes through to decide who's managed, who's not. Being a managed client, one of the things they're going to propose to you most likely is the MAC agreement. They're also going to propose to you different EA and MCA agreements that may save you money on your M365 licensing, and that's a good thing. I've seen cases where people have gotten as much as 30% off retail, say on a Microsoft E5 licensing pack. But they're going to propose you this MAC agreement at some point. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've signed that agreement. Generally, someone from IT leadership there would know about it because they have to. Two reasons. One, they're going to have to reach that commit level. And two, Microsoft sends regular updates to the key contacts, letting them know what their spend has been for that quarter. And that sort of outlines that commit agreement.
Awesome. And James has been gracious enough to put everything from that last slide that you're seeing on the screen inside the chat. So if you're looking for those hyperlinks, it's tough to click on that in a webinar, but it's a lot easier if you just go to the chat. The hyperlinks are there and they are viable. Again, if you want to do the cost savings programs that we have at US Cloud/Parex, go ahead and submit a ticket. We can give you that information. On average, if your spend is over $100,000 a year, we're saving customers 30% of their spend. So if your spend is, like we had a customer recently, $6 million a year, we saved them $1.6 million in our 8-week program. There's a lot of savings to be had and automation to be used for our cost savings plan. We appreciate all your time and effort in joining us today. This session was recorded. We will be sending out a link to everyone that, everyone that registered and attended. And I appreciate all your help. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day. The deck will be in there too as part of the presentation, as part of the slide show. So have a great day and have a great weekend. Thank you, everybody.